Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. There's an interesting sort of thing you see if you talk to atheists for more than a little bit of time, which I like to call the atheist just so stories for miracles. In a real technical sense, by the way, it should be the materialist just so stories for miracles, or they've rebranded themselves to naturalist, although that really doesn't make a difference. Anyway, there's such an overlap, I don't see it being much of an issue. But that said, some people are sticklers, so just so that everybody knows what I'm talking about. Okay. The thing I'm talking about is where you take some story of a miracle, or better yet, miracles, and then you pick one of them, in the case of the multiple ones, and then come up with some sort of materialist-friendly explanation for something kind of like what happened that you then claim that people mistook for there being a miracle. It can get a little bit silly about the sorts of things, because it tends to be of the form like, this phenomenon just happened. I have no idea why it happened. Must be God. Or often, a god, and make one up, etc. I'll refer you to my video on the origin myths for religion. I don't want to get into how silly this is now. But, so you then take that, and then any other miracles that are attached nearby, you simply refer to as later accretions. This being something of a metaphor to how sedimentary rock is formed, where particles land and then accrete into the substance until you have a rock that forms later on. So the idea being then people added additional stories because, if there's one thing people can be relied on to do, it's to take really important stories that they think actually matter and then just make up random stuff about them. They definitely do that all the time. It's pretty much what people do. The more important it is, the more they feel free to just make up random stuff about it. Anyway, that's not to say people never lie, and people sometimes elaborate. And there is such thing, of course, as people misremembering the details and then making them, their imaginations, making things up to fill it in. Anyway, so that's the basis of the atheist just so story for a miracle. You then reject the miracle on the basis of having some sort of materialist-friendly explanation that you say aha, because of this, clearly this is what happened, and then the gullible people involved just thought it was a miracle, etc., and then the legend built from there. So to give an example, there's I forget how long ago it is now, a few years, I think, where some people did a computer modeling study of a portion of the Red Sea where the current tends to, or the tide or something like that, tends to flow in one direction. And if you have a strong wind going in the opposite direction, given the geography and so on, if the wind was at least this fast, etc., you actually would get it to the point where it would actually push and hold the water up to the point where then the water would flow and you would actually get land, if fairly soggy land, that you could walk across. And then saying, I don't know whether this part was the original researchers or not. They might have been simply curious. I don't know their motives. They might have even been the other sort, which is the, we'll make this miracle more believable by saying that there's a naturalistic explanation that doesn't require a miracle. It's a very strange impulse some people have, but you can find that too. So I don't know what the originals were. It could be any one of those things. It could be other things. But there are people who have seized on this for this sort of thing, and it provides a very good example of it, where you say, if the wind happened to go like this, and happened to be the same way that it says that happened actually in the book of Exodus. Anyway, so if a wind went like that, that would happen, and then you'd have the water, and then you'd have the land that you could then cross. It'd be, you get the bottoms of your feet wet, but, it's not like you'd splash up to your ankles or splash up to your knees or anything. So you could then walk across, and then when the wind ceases, the thing would start to flow in the way that it always does normally. Okay, so no miracle required. This just happened to happen right as the Israelites were fleeing, and this coincidence can be explained by, if it didn't happen, we wouldn't hear about this story. Love that. It's the weak anthropic principle, basically, where for anything that happened, just say that if it didn't happen, then we wouldn't be talking about it. And hey, no problems. Just paper over anything you want. Anyway, so happened to happen right then. The Israelites then thought, aha, it must be God doing this because we're actually the chosen people. And this God, whatever it is that we just made up, must love us. So let's go across. And then, hey, wait, even better, the Egyptians just drowned when they followed after us. So this God that we just made up must really, really love us. And then later generations made up the stories about the God loving them even earlier and so on. Now, I'm not telling this in a particularly convincing way. The way you usually see it is told much more, with much greater skill. It's told in a much more convincing sort of way, where a person weaves a fairly well-constructed narrative around this, saying, isn't this just so much more plausible? And, that's the part where you come to, well, no. It's only more plausible if you assume from the outset that the former thing was implausible. Basically, if you assume materialism, then yes, the materialist explanation is far more plausible than something that you have held to be impossible. This shouldn't really shock anybody. But here's the thing you come to, and there's sort of a general issue with this sort of approach, which is, first off, the first issue is when you simply weave a narrative, tell a good narrative, narratives on their own tend to have a certain element of being convincing to them, because a narrative, our minds naturally think in narratives. We love narratives. This is, of course, one of the reasons, by the way, why people who are good at teaching very often teach in narratives. They use things like parables and metaphors and stories, because these convey truths much better than do simply like ticking off information in a simple logical fashion. There just happen to be a bunch of people who, for whatever reason, don't understand things communicated in this fashion, so they have a lot of trouble with them. Many of them are fundamentalists of one kind or another, whether atheist or Christian, or other. Anyway, so there's that. If you put it in a narrative form, no matter what it is, and you can do this for pretty much anything. I mean, you can weave a pretty convincing narrative about about how the Earth is actually flat and why people think that it's a globe. You can weave a pretty convincing narrative about how the moon landings were faked. You can weave a pretty convincing narrative about just about anything. The skill set is always, pick the things that work, connect them really well, leave out all the things that question this narrative in any way, and when you're done, you can have a pretty darn convincing narrative. It can be told about things that are true, it can be told about things that are false. In fact, we have now, for the last several hundred years, human beings have been telling the modern fiction story. It's only a few hundred years old. The modern realistic fiction story, I think it's called, where it's really the 1700s. I mean, I think the first example of it may be found in the 1600s, but it's where you invent lots of unimportant details to make the thing sound more convincing. So you make it sound, basically you invent the sort of details that if you were recounting a story that happened in extreme detail, that's what you do, because lots of unimportant stuff happened. Departed greatly from epic poetry and other sorts of poetry and narratives that had happened by the inclusion of all this not very important detail that makes it much more lifelike. Anyway, so, I'm sorry, not anyway, but taking this as a thing, that's sort of what gets done here is you pick up the details that you want, you put them in, you make up a bunch of details as hypothetical details that produce that feeling of being there, of having an experience narrated from somebody's memory. And that experience of feeling like something was narrated from somebody's memory tends to leave a very strong impression on our minds. Even if you're making the whole thing up, is in the case of novels. Novels all feel, at least halfway skilled novels, feel very real to us because they do that exact thing. Same skill being used here. You invent a plausible sounding materialist explanation for whatever miracle you want. You'll find them about Jesus walking on water. Well, it was actually a very shallow sandbar that the people here, just the fishermen here, didn't know because they don't know anything about water, and didn't notice, and so it looked like he was walking on water, but he was actually walking on this very shallow sandbar that extended all the way to their boat that they just never noticed. But again, like taking that story, they always leave out that extended up to their boat and they didn't notice the sandbar that they could have like reached out and poked with their fingers. Okay, fine, you know. That's the basis of how you do it. You make it very convincing by doing that. The second part of it, so first off, you're just, by telling this narrative, no matter what you're saying, no matter how plausible or implausible, you're making it sound plausible by telling it in a convincing sort of way. All right. The other thing is that whether or not a materialist explanation is more or less plausible than some other explanation is basically entirely predicated on whether or not you happen to be a materialist. Now, I've seen a fair number of atheists who will... I've talked with a fair number of atheists who will tend to say things like, come on, in everyday life, you know, somebody says that, like, I drove here in a magic sleigh, you know, does that really, you know, are you going to believe that over they drove here in a car? And the answer is, well, nobody does that. Nobody comes up and says to you casually, yep, I just flew here in my magic sleigh. So, is the pizza here yet, or are we still waiting for it? I'm kind of hungry. No one does that. Absolutely no one mentions something completely out of the ordinary in an utterly casual way. People who do talk about things out of the ordinary talk about them in a fashion that is out of the ordinary. And so it's one of those things where, like, yes, I'm not going to reach for I'm not going to reach for an unusual explanation in cases where there is absolutely no reason to reach for an unusual explanation. If everything surrounding an event is usual, I tend to assume that the explanation for it will be usual as well. Where things are very unusual, however, I tend to be very skeptical of usual explanations. If everybody is running down the street, I don't tend to figure that, like, guess a bunch of people were just all jogging at the same time for their health, and just by sheer chance happened to line up with each other in a big screaming mob. Pretty ordinary. No, I don't do that because the circumstances here are unusual. Now, people telling me in earnest, not as a joke, that they experience something very out of the ordinary is itself highly unusual. It does not make any sense, actually, in the ordinary course of events, to experience something extremely unusual and figure this must have an incredibly common ordinary explanation to it. All the more so when I'm sorry. Yeah, it's worth getting into. And this is something C.S. Lewis would bring up a bunch of times, and so would Chester and most everyone else. The other thing is, it depends on who you're talking to, who you know. If you're talking to somebody who is always serious, who is a serious sort of person, a practical sort of person, the sort of person who is very hard to fool, this is not the sort of person who I would assume is going to grasp at anything. On the flip side, if, you know, there's always some cousin who's desperate to believe something or other, and, you know, or relative or friend or what have you. And if that person who is desperate to believe something happens to have had some experience of the thing that you know they're desperate to believe, yeah, I'd like to see something really, really, truly extraordinary here, because the last 17 times turned out to be nothing. There's a really, really big difference here. Now, assuming that everybody who has had any sort of unusual experience is that desperate person is itself either the product of an incredibly, incredibly limited life experience, or, again, what's often quite common too, is simply assuming your conclusion, starting off with the premise that nothing unusual ever happens, and then filtering everything through that, where if anybody has any unusual experience, you just assume they must be desperate to believe in an unusual experience, so they sort of took any detail that could kind of fit and ran with it. If you actually look over history, really strange stuff happens, really unusual things happen. And moreover, if you look over history, people's ordinary experiences get violated all the time. And this comes to sort of you could call a fundamental judgment. that I see a lot, which is that there's a certain sort of person who assumes that all the world is exactly like their experience. All people are just like them. Everything that happens is just like their ordinary experience, and therefore anything that deviates from this in any way must be people, being hysterical, making things up, etc. I can't really relate to this. I'm skeptical enough in general that I'm also skeptical of myself too. So I'm skeptical of my instinctual reactions, my intuitive reactions, as well as other things. I like to, hear out everything because, I've had the experience of having gotten something wrong at some point in my life. Now, there's one side note to that, which is that some people, I think, come to this by way of having hoped to believe something themselves, jumped the gun on something, gotten disappointed, and then massively overreacted, assuming that everything must therefore be a disappointment. That's its own problem that's somewhat separate from what I'm talking about. It can produce similar results, though, so I just want to disambiguate them, so I'm not painting with too broad a brush. That's a different thing where you just have to get over the fact that you've been disappointed in the past and realize that just because, you were disappointed doesn't mean that things will always go badly. This is true of human relationships. It's true of most everything. On the flip side, the general intuition that everything is very simple and orderly and straightforward and you're familiar with it all is, I think, something that a lot of people need. Many, I'm not talking about fraction of the population, many people need in order to feel secure. We live in a very insecure sort of world. And, the modern world with all its technological changes, with so many people being pushed into each other's lives and so on, a lot of people are very, it's very unsettling. And a lot of people need things to have some sort of settled order. We need some fixed points. And so there are people who settle on, my life must be, very representative of everything. This must be a sort of fixed point in the universe. It's a very strange thing to latch on to, but it's kind of understandable, I think. One hallmark of this sort of person, by the way, is people who do not understand criminals. People who've never been to prison, who don't understand criminals, who don't understand how it happens, who have some sort of ridiculous explanation for criminality, such as all criminality is mental illness, or all criminality is poverty, or anything like that, where their explanation for crime is all something very, very simple and very, very different from them. That is one of the big hallmarks of this sort of person I've discovered in my own experience, because when they look at crime, which is something they've never committed any serious crime, minus the way there's there's the saying that everybody in the United States, everyone commits 2 federal felonies a day because the federal law is just so big and sprawling, it's impossible not to, and counterintuitive and unjust and so on. Excepting minor details like that, where it can be all sorts of ridiculous things can be federal felonies. But, the real serious crimes that most everybody throughout the world tends to actually think of as crimes. You have things like murder and theft and rape and arson and stuff like that. They've never done it. They don't know anybody who's done it. No one in their family's done it. None of their friends have ever done it. It's foreign to them. People don't do this sort of thing. People don't commit these serious crimes. And therefore, their explanation for people who commit these crimes is something incredibly, tremendously foreign. And it's something very, very simple and very, very neat that keeps their world entirely safe from anyone ever committing any sort of crime or doing anything really horribly bad. And I've in my own experience, I've seen a huge correlation between that and the sort of people who figure that miracles certainly cannot possibly happen. They just don't. And it seems to me to be related, very closely related to that psychological need for stability, in particular for intelligible stability, that everything is the way I think it is, that the things I'm used to are the only things I need to get used to. There's not much to say about this. It's obviously weakness, it's obviously wrong. There's not much to say that's right about it. There's nothing much that it's getting fundamentally right. It flows, I think, out of the human need for stability, but it doesn't get much of anything right about the world. Obviously, day to day, moment to moment, most moments are like the moment before them. But, when you live for a while, awful lot of moments aren't. Things actually change. Stuff really happens. And stuff really changes. Stuff really becomes different. There really are such things as famines and wars and all sorts of other things. And the same sort of people, I've noticed, have a strong need to believe that no matter who gets elected in politics, everything's actually going to be exactly the same. No matter, what happens, everything's going to work out exactly the same. It's as I said, it's that sort of psychological need. And as far as I've seen, this tends to be where that idea that miracles are on their face impossible often comes from. So it's, and if you want to believe that, it's really, really easy to convince yourself of. You just point to charlatans, point to people who've been mistaken, and say like, because there are people who fake things and people who've never been right, everything must be those. I mean, you can do the same thing about pretty much anything. You can do the exact same thing about, you can do the exact same thing about investments. It's really, really easy to show. Like, there have been lots of frauds about investments, lots of people overstate gains and so on. Therefore, there's no such thing as a good investment. Well, I mean, yeah, there is. You can do you can occasionally meet people who do the same thing about people of the opposite sex. There's no such thing as a good man. There's no such thing as a good woman. They're all hiding something. Actually, there are. They're good men. They're good women. I mean, it's a fallen world, but, given that. You can see it all over the place. Miracles are, of their nature, much more uncommon, and even more than that, the thing about miracles is, not being natural phenomena, they are not normally distributed amongst the population. They don't, things like fires, things like unusually bad weather and earthquakes and so on, like they are much more normally distributed. They happen with some regularity, very independent of the human beings to whom they happen to. Not universally, and, there are high crime areas and low crime areas and various other things. Many of these things are correlated, but nonetheless, either happen frequently or happen fairly independently of people. The thing about miracles is because miracles are performed by the creator of the universe, who is intimately familiar with every detail because he sustains the universe in its existence in every moment. So everything that exists in its creator, who is sustaining its existence and, its unfolding, who creates the time in which, his creation is unfolding. It is not in any way at all independent of, anything. It's dependent on literally everything. As a result, it doesn't admit of the same sort of things. The same problem applies, by the way, to behaviors. Like, if you want to see, if you couldn't put together a scientific experiment to determine whether or not things are good dating practices. Because if a person, good courtship practices, let me put it that way, good courtship practices, that is the attempt by a single person in order to woo another person into a mutual relationship where they agree to marry and then have children and raise these children together. Because nobody sane is going to alter their behavior in how they attempt to talk a specific, meet and form a relationship with a specific human being who may be the co-ancestor of their descendants, in order to please somebody running a scientific experiment. So when somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I'll give you $50 if once every Friday you punch the person you're dating in the face. Only lunatics will take you up on this, and you will learn nothing about ordinary people. And the same thing is true, it doesn't need to be, something like assault, but pretty much anything. There is absolutely nothing on the basis of which I'm going to, treat my wife differently because some other stranger is asking me to vary things. I'm not going to do something that I think is worse for her. I'm not going to do something that I think is less than the best way to treat my wife for somebody else. And so miracles, because they are part of a personal relationship between persons, are going to have the exact same property that you can't experiment on them in the same way. It's not like God is going to treat somebody worse on the basis of you gave God $50 in order to, treat somebody worse, or, that God's going to do something which ultimately, and when I say treat worse, I mean, given that God's plan includes all of creation throughout all of creation's existence throughout time, it doesn't, you can't even articulate it without sounding absurd if you actually know any theology. You can't put together such an experiment. It doesn't make any sense. Prayer is the relation of one person to another, which in love is asking for something, and so is going to be answered in love, that is to say, in concern for all the people involved. A disinterested attempt to establish a fact which has nothing to do with love is going to, by its nature, cut itself off from this. It is literally theoretically impossible to do anything like this, just like it is theoretically impossible to establish a scientific study in how to court a wife. Nobody sane will take part in this. Everybody who has even a drop of sanity will refuse to take part in the experiment. So, actually, one final thing to wrap this up, because I know this has gone on a little long. The ultimate, I think, cause for that is something you do see in failed relationships. And that is the willingness to only believe in what you can control. I think I may have mentioned this in a previous video. I'm not sure. Actually, I really need to do a scripted video about all this stuff. But just to conclude it, the desire to, I'll believe in a miracle if I can do an experiment which shows a miracle, is a desire to be able to control the miracle. If you can control it, if you can produce it, then it clearly exists. And to show where this goes wrong, it's easiest to look at, again, romantic relationships. You find people who'll say, like, well, I'll believe you love me if you do this for me. And where this is something that the person would not ordinarily do except for having been asked. And very often, actually, because, I'm sorry, you run into the problem where if it was something the person might have done anyway, well, then maybe they just wanted to do it. Maybe it wasn't because of you. So it's you then run into the problem very rapidly of where it has to be something against the person's interest, something really absurd. Hence you see things like, for example, the I'll believe you love me if you buy me this really, really absurdly expensive thing where you have to go into debt in order to be able to afford it. Engagement rings can be like this, but there are lots of other examples too. Expensive trips or expensive houses, cars. If you really love me, we'll go into massive debt for this house. Or if you really love me, we'll go on this vacation that is incredibly hard for us to afford. Things like that, anything of this nature. It's that attempt to prove through control that if I can control this, if I can make sure that the only reason this happened is because I said so, then I'll believe in it. And at its root, that's basically a form of solipsism, because it's only being willing to believe, if things only happen because you control them, basically you're only willing to believe in anything that's an extension of yourself. And ultimately, I think it really comes from a person's unwilling to believe in anything but themselves. It's not that they've gone full solipsist, it's just that they have this sort of temptation that they're partially giving into towards solipsism, where their compromise is, I'll believe in the external world if I can control it all. So I think that's where it comes from. And this has run on a little bit long. I will do scripted videos on this subject and the subjects that I talked about. I know this format's not ideal. It's what I can do right now. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.